This week, I bring back Thom Singer to the podcast to discuss how and what he learned in getting scrappy with his business and career during the pandemic. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 255 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. This week, I'm bringing back Thom Singer to the podcast. I've known Thom for well over a decade, and I first had him on the podcast back in 2017 to discuss his pivot from business development for law firms to becoming a full-time public speaker and master of ceremonies for primarily associations. When the pandemic started, Thom's business completely shut down. And I had him on in episode 185 discuss how he was coping. I later brought him back for episode 213 in July of 2021 to get an update. Thom recorded an end-of-year episode for his own podcast called What I Learned the Last 2 Years. I was so impressed with the episode that I wanted to bring Thom back on to discuss what he has had to do to adapt his business, but more importantly, what he's had to do to maintain his own mental health and happiness. Before we go any further, let me mention I have a sponsor, Magic Mind. Magic Mind is the world's first productivity drink. It's not an energy or coffee-based drink, but a drink that will help you stay focused. I've been using it for several months and has made a real difference. But more on this later in the show. Now, on to my discussion with Thom Singer. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I have again the real joy of having my buddy Thom Singer back on the podcast. And I had Thom back in March of 2021. And I thought I'd bring him back on and tell us where he is today. So welcome to the podcast, Thom.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for having me back.
Thom, why don't you let people know? I had Thom on in the middle of July of 2020 as his business had collapsed. And I had him back on in March of 2021 about how he had adapted. But why don't you take us back to those early days and tell us what you were doing and then what happened?
Yeah, the last 2 years have been interesting and probably something I never would have expected, that I'd be in my mid-50s and I'd watch everything I'd worked for kind of, unravel to certain degrees. If we go back to February or early March of 2020, I remember giving a keynote speech. I make my living as a keynote speaker, and previous to the pandemic, that's all I did. I had what I would call a traditional speaker business. I would go and speak for companies or association conferences. I'd get a check. I'd get on a plane. I'd go to the next conference. And I remember being in Hawaii, and it was mid-March or early March. And there was a little bit of worry of what if they closed down air travel, right? Things hadn't really gotten there yet. It wasn't that March 13th kind of D-Day where everything started to unravel. But I remember being in Hawaii thinking, wow, what if I got stuck here for 2 weeks? Because if there was a lockdown, everybody thought it was going to be like 2 weeks long. And my hotel room had this view of Diamond Head in Oahu. And I remember thinking, a lockdown wouldn't be so bad if I had to stay right here. And that was all I thought was, oh, this could be a 2 week long thing. And what ended up happening was what's now a 2 year long thing, and still some time before we probably fully put it all back together. So everything on my calendar canceled in March of 2020 for the rest of that year. And, we all know what happened, right? Everything kind of went there. So I went from having a pretty decent income and a career I'd built for over a decade as a speaker to no income for several months. There was a little bit of pivoting. There was some virtual work, but not as much as a lot of people think. A lot of people think that the speaking industry, everything just pivoted to be online, and that wasn't entirely true. It was kind of like relearning a whole other business. So I had to get scrappy. I had to get creative, and I looked for other ways to put my career back together. And so I started doing some coaching. I have a background in working with lawyers on business development. So I started doing training and coaching for law firms. And then I went to work for an executive search firm doing business development for them part-time. They had been a client of mine. I had spoken at their partner meeting. And so they knew me, and I was looking for some ways to do things. So I've gone to work for them. And then I started hosting podcasts as sort of the hired host for the shows. I already had one before the pandemic, and I now host 3 podcasts for organizations who are looking for someone. They didn't have anyone on their staff who really had the skills or the personality to host the show. And then I do a little bit of, other types of things here and there. And it's been really hard. And at the same time, it's been really hard. It's been really challenging. And at the same time, it's been a strong area of personal growth for me, if you will.
So when you say personal growth, how have you grown?
Well, I think, first of all, when you start a business and you have success, there's a little bit of an ego piece that comes in. I think I got whacked upside the head right in the middle of my ego. I had to learn that, like anybody else, I face all kinds of ups and downs along the way. The other thing is, before the pandemic, I made a commitment to learn how to meditate. And so fortunately, a few months beforehand, I had started meditating every day. And what I found was, going through especially 2020, but even 2021 and now into 2022, I found that it allowed me to stay grounded and stay in reality. I think that if I hadn't started on sort of this little spirituality journey with the meditation, I started studying Taoism. If I hadn't done those 2 things, I think I would have sat in the corner and cried for many months. And instead, I only sat in the corner and cried for a couple of weeks.
It's interesting how this whole pandemic has affected us, and we've had choices as to how we want to react to it. I know myself, I've gone through some major mindset shifts. And it's been interesting watching you, in the fact that I said you could have crawled up like in a little ball and melted, but you didn't. And the other piece is, you diversified your income. And I know my wife, when she was a massage therapist, at one point she literally had one client that was making up about 60-70% of her business. And then that client went into the nursing home. Boom. And that all went away. And so tell us about the mindset shifts you've had to go through in diversifying your portfolio.
Well, for one, I really loved what I did, and I just planned to do exactly what I was doing for the next 10 years. I really didn't have a plan B sort of in my pocket. So part of it was realizing that you probably always should have a plan B in your pocket. And especially, I'm now 55 years old. I was 53 when the whole pandemic thing started to hit. You kind of reach a point of comfort. You figure out by the time you're 50 who you are. You know what your strengths are. You know what your weaknesses are. You get very comfortable, maybe a little bit complacent in that. And I had everything kind of got shook upside down. My identity was tied in a lot of ways to my career. And I think that's a pretty common thing for people. And when my career vanished, or at least temporarily vanished, it hit me really hard. And I had to go through this thing of, am I more than just getting up on stage and giving a speech to a corporation? And where are those things? And what is important to me? And what do I have to work through? And like I said, studying Taoism kind of taught me that life is just a river that flows, and water has one choice, and that is you go downhill and you have to move around obstacles. And that's what I've had to do. My whole mindset has been, okay, I don't have control of the current of what's going on in this river. I thought I did. I thought I was in full control after spending 10 years building this little lifestyle business that I had. I thought I was in full control. I never imagined that the whole world could shut down and live meetings would come to a complete halt. I did consider the fact that I could age out of the business. I did consider that my topic could become less popular, but I never had dreamed that the business would have a big parking brake pulled. So the mindset shift was realizing that, this is all bigger than I am. And part of me just has to be willing to, sit in the moment, go with the flow, and realize that the worst case scenario wasn't horrible. The worst case scenario is we couldn't pay the mortgage and we had to sell the house. Well, we didn't get to that point. I found ways to keep us afloat over the last 2 years. I did have to borrow some money. I got a government loan, and I hate to have debt, and it's going to take me a couple of years probably to pay that off once I get things turned around. But, having a little bit of debt at a really low interest rate is not the end of the world, for me. So I had to realize that I can't necessarily be in control. And if I look at what the worst case scenario is, and I'm not caught up in the worst case, then I'm doing better than that. And I just had to look at that as a plus.
Now, a word from our sponsor, Magic Mind, which I said in the introduction is the world's first productivity drink. I first tried the product when we were driving from Austin back to our home in Ajijic, Mexico last October. It really helped me stay focused on the road, and that was very noticeable to me, as this is a tiring 3-day drive. I drink Magic Mind with my morning joe or coffee, and I actually like the taste and sip on the product while drinking my morning cup of joe. I continue to use the product during my annual content audit, where I had to go through every piece of content on the Career Pivot website. And I will tell you, there was close to 1,000 pieces of content, and I found Magic Mind invaluable in helping me stay focused. Magic Mind is a productivity drink. It's not an energy or coffee-based drink, but a drink that will help you stay focused on what you're doing, beat procrastination, and get you into a working flow state. As I said, I drink this with my coffee. After 30 minutes, I'm ready to go to work. If you continue to use this on a daily basis after 5 to 10 days, you will notice you are more productive, stop procrastination, and will get you into a working flow state much, much easier. There are lots of ways to consume the product, including making a latte, chugging, or sipping. Magic Mind works for me, and I believe it's going to work for you. I have a 20% discount code available for you. You can go to magicmind.co/repurpose and use the discount code repurpose20. That is magicmind.co/repurpose and use the discount code repurpose20. As always, you will find the link, and the discount code will be included in the show notes. Yeah, one of the things I really liked was when all this started, you said, I'm going to talk to one smart person every day. Tell us about that strategy.
So it was probably April 2020 when I was really kind of in that spiral, right? I did spend a couple of weeks curled up in a ball in the corner, not knowing what to do. And one day I realized that, look, I can't figure my way out of a global pandemic all by myself. And within the industry of professional speakers and meeting planners, I knew a lot of people. And then within the concept of the world in different industries, I knew a lot of smart individuals. And so I came up with a plan that 5 days a week, I would talk to one smart person a day. And a lot of these people, you were on that list. A lot of these people were people I already knew, kind of reach out, touch base, see how people were doing, make sure everybody was okay in the situation, everybody was healthy. And then in the conversation, I turned it around and said, hey, the purpose for this is, I'm in a bit of a quandary. Here's what's happening in my world. Do you have any ideas for me? And I'll be really honest with you. Some of the people had no ideas. They were like, wow, I wouldn't even know where to begin. Some people have had dumb ideas. Well, not dumb, but just useless ideas or repetitive ideas, things I had thought of, things other people had told me. But 5 or 6 people over the course of 2020 came up with ideas for me that inspired me either directly or inspired me to go a different direction. And that's how I was able to piece together some of these different things, I did that brought me income. So one person I knew who was a speaker and a trainer, she did very large corporate trainings for companies like Coca-Cola and Nike and things like that. And that wasn't the world that I lived in. So I had to take her advice and take it into the world of smaller businesses and law firms and accounting firms. But she created a series of sales training programs for those companies directly geared toward what was going on during the pandemic. So I created a program for law firms and accounting firms called Social Tightening While Social Distancing. And so in the midst of, this probably came up in the summer of 2020, for the whole second half of 2020, I was doing online short series of training, helping people come up with ideas of ways to stay in front of their clients that was useful and provided value. And I ended up working for about, 15 or 18 different service firms doing these, 1 hour, 2-time series type things. And it wasn't highly paid. It was much lower than the rate I normally would get. But when I stitched together 18 of them, I was able to take care of my basic needs financially through the end of the year. Another person I talked to was my friend who is the head of United States for this executive search firm. And he had talked to me before about working part-time doing business development for him because I have a big network. I know a lot of companies. And he said, look, it's an eat what you kill job, but if you can find leads that we can turn into business, that can work out for you. And so in the midst of that call, I ended up going to work for Stanton Chase International. And I'll be honest with you, I only work part-time, but it's the best company I've ever worked for. I will most likely, if I can make it work and I'm still learning the business, I'll most likely work for them for the rest of my career, even though it'll be, on a part-time basis, just because it's a great company and all of my skills that I've all worked on for 25, 30 years fit into this world of executive search. It's all about connecting the dots, human connection, and, trust and accountability and success. And those are the things I've been teaching for years. So the industry itself fits in with my skill sets. So it was literally piecing together these little ideas from people and saying, okay, I can run with that allowed me to survive the last 2 years.
Now you're hosting a bunch of podcasts now. Did you go out and pursue them? Because you've got a very successful podcast yourself, making waves at sea level. Did you pursue them or did they come to you?
It was a little bit of both. So 4 years ago, I started hosting a show for a client of mine. I had been the master of ceremonies for their convention for several years. They had pivoted away from doing the convention even before the pandemic hit. And they wanted to start an educational podcast. And so I was the co-host of that show. I was sort of the producer and the co-host. And, I told people that I did that. And I started during the pandemic to say, wow, what if I could come up with a couple of more shows where I'm the host? None of these are highly paid, but when you stitch 3 of them, and my goal would be 6 of them together, all of a sudden you can have a certain amount, of income. So yeah, I talked it up, and then people I knew came and said, hey, I want to start this show. What would you charge? How would we do this? And then through the course of that, I've now started a program called Event Specific Podcasts, which is geared towards association and company meetings, doing short form podcasts, not a weekly show, but doing 6 or 12 episodes leading up to and following the event to be able to promote the event, highlight sponsors, and keep the community engaged. And I just launched that product, and I'm in negotiations with a couple of organizations to host those for them. So I took a skill that I had and I monetized it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've been watching you over the last 2 years and how you have been willing to try stuff, and not all of it has worked, but you were willing to try and measure and say, okay, this worked, this didn't work. Okay, it doesn't work. That's fine. We'll move on to the next thing.
And I'm having to do more of that. This isn't over, right? The live meetings industry hasn't totally rebounded yet. I've started to see signs of it in November and December. I booked several speaking opportunities live in person for January and early February. And then the Omicron variant came along and all of those postponed or canceled. So I watched sort of a beachhead appear that I was able to storm the beach, and then we flooded out again and we were back on a life raft. So, I have to continue doing that. And my expectation is we probably have another year before we see the real strength of the meetings industry come back in the way that I would need it to support my little slice of that pie, which means I have to keep, being scrappy. I have to keep looking for new ways to make things happen, uncovering a bunch of rocks. And like you said, trying things and being okay that some of the things I try aren't going to land, because I'm still not back to where I want to be, but I look around and this isn't a new story to be, and this is your whole business is based around this, to be 55 years old and have your career turned upside down. I'm not the first person in history who has had this happen. I just happen to be going through it in the midst of this, really weird pandemic situation that directly impacted my business. A lot of people who I've talked to are like, I don't understand why you're having such a hard time. I talked to one person who was a banker, and you would think a banker would have a full understanding of how small businesses are being impacted, but he banks tech companies that are venture funded, and his paycheck keeps coming every 2 weeks. To him, the pandemic was, I had to work at home and my kids are there. That's a pain in the ass. But his paycheck kept arriving every single week. And his clients, while they went through some interesting times, still had their funding. And so I do find it interesting that as a society, I call it the tale of two pandemics. We don't really realize that for some people, it has been devastating to their careers. And for other people, it's been a little blip of now we work from home. And so for me, because I'm on that first side of it, I've got to be out there turning things over, trying things and moving ahead. And I think that's what we have to do anytime, our career or our life gets turned upside down, is we have to say, okay, that yesterday is gone. What can I do today and tomorrow? And how can I, take that machete and clear that new path?
The other thing I wanted to mention was the fact that when you realized that you needed to reach out to, 100 plus people to say, what should I do next? You had to swallow your pride and be humble. And that's not something that many of us guys are good at doing. And so it's when you're in this position of, I don't know what I should be doing next, that Thom, I was been totally impressed how you've kind of pivoted and morphed and kind of juked and jived and kind of made this happen. So if you had if in a year from now, what do you think your business will look like? If that's assuming the meetings business comes back the way it used to be.
Sure. Well, and it is, I want to go back to what you said before about it. It is true. I mean, you do have to swallow your pride and your ego does take a hit. And luckily, it didn't bother me. And, I have a big ego. I like to do well. I like the applause that come along with the type of job that I have. And it was a little painful, but for some reason I was able to say, okay, I quickly pivoted to being in a position where I said, this is where I am. There were a lot of people in my industry who would post things online about how it was the most successful year they'd ever had. They pivoted everything virtually. But then when I'd talk to them privately, they're like, yeah, I'm doing a lot of this for free. And I literally said, well, why are you acting like you're having the best year ever? And they go, oh, well, you got to fake it till you make it. I actually don't believe in fake it till you make it. I think that advice comes from a good place. The idea is have the mindset of success as you work towards success. But the way fake it till you make it is actually implemented is it comes out as go out and be a fraud until you can make it. And that just doesn't sit well with me. And so I'm pretty transparent. So for me, it was like, yeah. And I'm still in a position where it's like, yeah, I'm struggling. And I'm okay with that because I also know that I won't be struggling for the next 40 years. There will be a point where I figure it out. So to answer your question of what do I think next year will look like, as the meetings business comes back, I expect a large amount of my income will start to come from in-person keynotes again around this whole idea of human connection and the power of people being able to influence, your career, your life, et cetera. And in a way, what I'm going through is actually an example for what I teach, because I haven't done this alone. It has been these people who I've been connected with who've given me opportunities and led me down the path to be able to pivot and be able to be scrappy. So I think that actually my content becomes stronger. I think being kicked in the ego teeth makes me more humble, which probably makes me more relatable and stronger. So I think, and I hope, that over time, my business as a keynote speaker and a corporate trainer will actually be stronger because of the 2 or 3 year period that I've gone through. I also think that, I would love to be hosting 3 or 4 more podcasts in addition to the ones that I have and having that as a little bit of an income stream. And then I would like to continue working with law firms. I'd gone back to that versus, I used to be the marketing director for a law firm. So when I started speaking, that was my market and I had moved away from it. I found out I like working with lawyers. So I want to find ways to coach and train more directly in that niche. So I'm going to focus more back on that law firm and accounting firm niche that I came out of originally. And so, I think that in the end, I walk out the other side of this better or more well-rounded, but I do think we've got another year plus before I get, on that solid ground.
I said, when John Tarnoff and I talked about we did a reality check-in, one of the key attributes now is adaptability. The one thing we have learned is nothing's going back the way it used to. And this isn't over, and we don't even know whether this is ever going to really go away.
I think at some point it doesn't necessarily go away. I mean, the flu doesn't go away, but I think that we figure out how to control it and how to treat it, and it becomes less of a fearful thing. I think with this latest variant that we went through, we've seen a lot of that. Like college campuses this year have been able to deal much differently. My daughter is a sophomore in college, and freshman year, they were locked down. You were sent home if you were found in a group of more than 2 or 3 people, no questions asked. This year, they've kind of taken the attitude that this is part of our life. We can have a little bit more positivity on the campus, because the mental health issues that are attached to what we've gone through have been horrific. And that's another thing that's not really being talked about, is how hard many areas, not just career, but many areas of this have affected people in our population. So I think you're right about what you and your friend talked about, that adaptability is more important now than ever. And I think for people who listen to your show, if they're going through some sort of a career pivot, if they're going through something that is upending them, even if it's not the pandemic, there's still other reasons that people are finding themselves, struggling with career options. I think one of the things you have to realize is that when you're in that dark place, and like I said, I've been there for 2 years, when you're in that dark place and you don't have full control of what's going on, I think what you have to realize is that there will come a point where you'll figure it out. And so, look towards that place, work towards that place, and throw a lot of spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just try stuff and be willing to, say, okay, that didn't work. Let's move on. Let's try the next thing.
My motto when I turned 50, so this is 5 years ago, was I was going to make age 50 to 75 the best years of my life. And the motto became try new things. And that's another thing that I think helped me through this last 2 years, is even though it has sucked, I've held on to the fact that these are going to be the best years of my life. So, even though times have been tight, my wife and I, we're empty nesters now. Our youngest kid left for college during the pandemic. Last year, we found ways, even with the pandemic, to be able to travel. I had a nephew who got married, so we tacked on, a couple of days going and seeing the giant redwoods. I've had some other things that work-wise that have come up, and we've tacked on some travel to it and found ways to do it on the cheap. And so that's been really important.
So that's a good positive note to finish this on. Thom, if someone wanted to reach out and contact you, how might they do that?
So you can find me at my website, which is Thom, THOM, at thomsinger.com.
Thom, thank you very much for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here again. Thanks for having me, Mark.
I have been totally impressed with how Thom has adapted to this pandemic. It ain't been easy, and his need to continue to be scrappy is not going to end anytime soon. I think there's a lot to learn from how Thom has adapted to a very difficult situation. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the Career Pivot weekly newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn, and you will find me on Twitter at Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-255. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.